I speak 10 languages, Jesus Christ said. The atheist judge laughed but was left speechless the moment he heard him speak. The laughter echoed briefly through courtroom 203 of the United States District Court in Manhattan, sharp and dismissive, the sound of a man confident that reason had already won. Judge Nathaniel Crowe leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, eyes cold with certainty. He had seen impostors before, false prophets, spiritual performers, men who wrapped ignorance in poetry and called it faith. This one, standing alone at the defendant's table without a lawyer or even an ID, looked no different. From the gallery, the reactions fractured. A few spectators smirked, already bored. A court clerk lowered her gaze, uneasy. The prosecutor adjusted her papers, convinced the case was over, before it had truly begun. The man called Gabriel Reyes rumpled shirt-worn shoes. Calm eyes did not react at all. No defensiveness, no plea. Just silence, steady and unafraid, as if the moment unfolding had been expected. 10 languages, the judge repeated, amusement curling into his voice. This court deals in evidence, not miracles. Then Gabriel spoke. Not loudly, not theatrically. He turned slightly, addressing a court interpreter seated along the wall. The words that left his mouth were not rehearsed phrases or broken syllables. They flowed ancient, precise, unmistakably native. The interpreter stiffened. His pen slipped from his fingers. Before the judge could interrupt, Gabriel shifted again. This time toward a woman in the back row, an immigrant witness waiting for an unrelated hearing. Her eyes widened as she heard her childhood dialect, one rarely spoken outside a single rural region, spoken perfectly tenderly, as if carried from memory rather than study. Her hand flew to her mouth. The room changed. The laughter died first, then the murmurs. Even the air seemed to thicken heavy with a tension no procedure could explain. Gabriel continued, turning, not like a performer seeking applause, but like a shepherd recognizing his flock. Each voice he addressed heard something familiar, too familiar. Not just language, but understanding. Judge Crowe straightened. His smile faltered. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing, searching for the trick, the explanation, the flaw that would restore order to his world. Enough, he said sharply. That proves nothing. But his voice no longer carried certainty, because Gabriel had not looked at him yet. When he finally did, the judge felt it, a strange pressure behind the ribs, a memory stirring where logic had buried it long ago. Gabriel spoke again, quietly now, in a tongue the courtroom did not recognize. Only one man did. The judge's breath caught. His hands tightened on the bench. The language, his mother's language, one she used only in whispers, only in prayer, only when she thought no one was listening. A dialect never entered into any record. A language Judge Crowe had not heard since childhood. The courtroom stood frozen, and in that suspended moment before the gavel could fall, before reason could recover, something ancient and undeniable began to crack through the armor of disbelief, something no law, no science, no arrogance could hold back. The United States District Court in Manhattan had a rhythm all its own, precise, unyielding, and indifferent to the human weight carried inside its walls. On that gray Tuesday morning, the building breathed routine. Metal detectors hummed. Shoes clicked against polished marble. Clerks moved with practiced efficiency, folders tucked tight against their chests, already thinking about lunch breaks and deadlines rather than destinies. Courtroom 203 sat halfway down the corridor, its wooden doors scarred by decades of authority. Inside, the American flag stood stiff behind the bench, its presence less symbolic than procedural here. Justice in this room was not poetic. It was numbered, timed, filed, and archived. Judge Nathaniel Crowe presided from the bench like a man fully at home in this order. To the bailiff, he was punctual. To the clerks, predictable. To the attorneys who passed through his courtroom, he was sharp, efficient, and famously unmoved by emotional appeals. Faith-based arguments rarely lasted more than a sentence before being cut short. This was a federal courtroom, not a pulpit. The prosecution table reflected confidence. The assistant U.S. attorney sat upright, case file, open tabs, neatly labeled. To her, this was a clean matter misrepresentation, possible fraud, a defendant with no credentials claiming impossible expertise. The system knew how to handle men like this. It always had. In the gallery, a small crowd watched with divided attention. Some were waiting for their own hearings, restless and distracted. Others had come out of curiosity, drawn by whispers of a man who claimed to speak 10 languages without formal training. A court clerk near the aisle scanned faces absently, unaware that this case would linger in her memory long after thousands of others faded. At the defendant's table stood Gabriel Reyes. He did not match the room. His clothes were ordinary, worn thin at the cuffs. His hands rested calmly on the table palms, open as if he had nothing to hide and nothing to grasp. No lawyer leaned toward him. No stack of papers waited for reference. He seemed strangely unconcerned with the architecture of power surrounding him, unmoved by the bench, the seal, the quiet threat of consequences. To the bailiff, he was another body to monitor. To the prosecutor, a problem to be resolved. To the judge, an irritation, yet somehow already an anomaly. The court reporter adjusted her headset fingers, hovering over the keys. She had transcribed thousands of voices in this room, angry, desperate, rehearsed, broken. She would later say that before Gabriel spoke another word, there was already something different in the air, like the pause before weather turns. Outside Manhattan surged forward without pause. Taxis honked. Coffee carts steamed. Office workers checked their phones, unaware that inside a federal courtroom, something was quietly stepping out of sequence. The judge cleared his throat, ready to restore order, to pull the proceeding back into its familiar lanes. The prosecution prepared to continue. The spectators settled. Everything appeared normal. And yet beneath the structure, beneath the rules and reason that governed every inch of that room, an unease had begun to spread, subtle, almost imperceptible. Not fear, not belief, expectation. As if the courtroom itself, hardened by decades of certainty, sensed that the case unfolding within its walls was about to test not just a defendant, but the limits of the system that judged him. They brought the defendant in without ceremony. No handcuffs clinked, no shackles scraped the floor, just the soft creak of the side door and a quiet instruction from the bailiff. The man stepped forward alone, guided by habit rather than force, as if he had walked into rooms like this before, though no record anywhere said he ever had. His name, according to the docket, was Gabriel Reyes. That was all the system had. No middle name, no date of birth that could be verified, no social security number, no driver's license, no digital trail. When federal databases were searched, they returned nothing but silence, an absence so complete it unsettled even the most seasoned clerks. It was as if the man had entered the country and the world without leaving a footprint. From the gallery, he looked unremarkable. Mid-40s, maybe older. Dark hair touched with gray at the temples. A white shirt neatly buttoned but creased with wear. Slacks faded at the knees. Shoes that had known long miles and little rest. The kind of man most people learn not to see in a city like New York. But those closest to him noticed something harder to explain. The bailiff felt at first a strange hesitation before stepping back, as if instinct had whispered the distance was appropriate. The court reporter paused, fingers hovering over the keyboard, struck by the man's stillness. He did not fidget, did not scan the room, did not look for reassurance. His posture carried no trace of fear nor defiance either. At the prosecution table, the assistant U.S. attorney studied him with practiced detachment. To her, he was an anomaly to be corrected. Men who claimed extraordinary abilities without credentials usually unraveled quickly. They always did. Confidence, she believed, was often just delusion with better posture. Judge Crow, however, saw something else, and it irritated him. The man's calm did not read as rehearsed. It was not the stiff calm of someone hiding panic. It was deeper than that, settled, almost patient, as though the outcome of the proceeding mattered far less to him than the people inside the room. When asked to state his name for the record, Gabriel spoke clearly, evenly. No embellishment, no explanation, just the name. Any identification, the clerk asked. No, Gabriel replied. No apology followed, no excuse. A murmur rippled through the gallery. In a federal courtroom, the absence of paperwork was not just unusual, it was dangerous. Identity was currency here. Without it, a person barely existed. Yet Gabriel stood as if existence were not something the court had the authority to grant or deny. His eyes moved briefly across the room, not scanning, not measuring, but resting on faces. A nervous immigrant clutching a folder of documents, a tired clerk rubbing her wrist, a guard shifting his weight after a long shift. Each glance lingered just a fraction too long, as if something unseen passed between them. Those who met his gaze felt it a subtle discomfort, not threatening, but exposing, like standing under a light that revealed more than it should. To the system, Gabriel Reyes was a problem. To the people watching, he was a question. And as he stood there without papers, without proof, without defense, the silence around him grew heavier, not with doubt, but with the unsettling sense that this man did not need the court to recognize who he was, because somehow, impossibly, it already felt like he knew exactly who they were. Judge Nathaniel Crowe had built his reputation on certainty. From the bench of courtroom 203, he looked every inch the federal judge Manhattan trusted black. Robe, pressed posture, rigid voice, sharpened by decades of authority. To junior attorneys, he was intimidating. To veteran prosecutors, dependable. To defense lawyers who leaned too heavily on sentiment, he was merciless. In Crowe's courtroom, feelings did not sway verdicts. Evidence did. Those who worked with him knew the story even if it was never spoken aloud. Crowe did not simply doubt faith, he rejected it with discipline. He called himself a rationalist, a man rescued from superstition by reason. Over the years, he had presided over cases involving fake healers, self-proclaimed prophets, and spiritual grifters who preyed on desperation. Each conviction hardened his resolve. Each sentence in his mind was a public service. Religion, Crowe believed, was a failure of logic dressed as hope. From his seat, he studied Gabriel Reyes with thinly veiled impatience. No lawyer, no documents, no fear. Men like this irritated him more than obvious criminals. At least criminals respected the rules enough to break them knowingly. This one stood as if the rules themselves were optional. Crowe tapped a pen once against the bench, a habit from years earlier picked up during trials that demanded focus. To the bailiff, it meant silence. To the court reporter, it meant something important was coming. To the prosecutor, it was permission to proceed. But Crowe's eyes never left the defendant. There was something about the man's composure that unsettled him, not because it threatened authority, but because it ignored it. Crowe was used to defiance. He knew arrogance, anger, and even righteous indignation. What he was not accustomed to was indifference to outcome. As Crowe leaned forward, memories stirred uninvited. A small kitchen years ago. A woman's voice speaking softly in a language Crowe had not heard in decades. A faith he once knew, then abandoned piece by piece after tragedy, taught him that prayers did not stop funerals. He pushed the thought away. This was a courtroom, not a confessional, Mr. Reyes. Crowe began, his tone clipped surgical. This court is not impressed by mystery. Claims require proof, and extraordinary claims require more than confidence. From the gallery, a few nodded. This was the judge they knew. Precise, controlled, unmoved. Crowe straightened, satisfied with the clarity of his position. He had no patience for myths wrapped in modern clothing. If this man believed he could charm his way through the system with calm eyes and poetic answers, he was mistaken. Yet even as Crowe spoke, something resisted inside him, a faint pressure behind the sternum, like a question he had once buried and did not wish to exhume. He ignored it. Because Judge Nathaniel Crowe did not believe in cracks. He believed in walls built of reason, reinforced by intellect, and tall enough to keep every impossible thing safely outside. At least that was what he had believed. Until this case placed a silent man before him who seemed to look past the wall entirely, as if it were never really there. The prosecutor rose with practiced confidence. Assistant U.S. Attorney Lauren Park did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her authority came from precision, the kind honed by years of standing in federal courtrooms where words carried consequences. She adjusted her jacket, stepped closer to the lectern, and opened a slim case file already marked with color-coded tabs. To the court, she began calm and clinical. This is not a case about belief. It is a case about deception. Her eyes flicked briefly toward Gabriel Reyes, then back to the bench. To her, the defendant was not mysterious. He was familiar. The pattern was one she had seen before: men who wrapped themselves in ambiguity to avoid accountability. The defendant claims to speak 10 languages fluently, Park continued. He presented himself as a professional interpreter in multiple humanitarian and legal settings over the past 6 months. Immigration clinics, medical facilities, community legal aid offices. She paused, letting the list settle. What he did not present, she said, tapping the file lightly, were credentials. No certifications, no academic records, No licensing, no proof of formal training of any kind. From the gallery, a murmur stirred. Several people leaned forward. Others crossed their arms, skeptical. Park turned a page. Witness testimony indicates that Mr. Reyes accepted compensation in connection with these services. Not always cash, sometimes meals, temporary shelter, goods, but compensation nonetheless. She looked up. That constitutes fraud. The word landed with weight. At the defense table, Gabriel did not flinch. Park pressed on her tone, sharpening. By impersonating a certified professional, the defendant placed vulnerable individuals at risk, immigrants navigating complex legal systems, patients communicating life or death medical information, families relying on accurate translation for their futures. She did not say it angrily. She said it as fact. To be clear, she added, this is not about kindness. It is about misrepresentation. Judge Crow listened, expression unreadable. This was the language he trusted. Statutes, definitions, boundaries. Park spoke his dialect fluently. She turned slightly toward the bench. Your Honor, when individuals fabricate expertise, even with good intentions, the harm is real. A mistranslated sentence can cost asylum. A misunderstood symptom can cost a life. The law exists to prevent exactly this. Her gaze returned to Gabriel. The defendant did not simply overestimate his abilities. He assumed authority he did not possess. For the first time, Gabriel lifted his head fully. His expression remained calm, but his eyes met hers steadily, not confrontational, not defensive. Park felt a flicker of irritation. Most defendants looked away by now. Some showed fear, others anger. This man showed neither. She closed the file. The United States will demonstrate that Mr. Reyes knowingly misrepresented himself, operated outside the law, and exploited trust, however subtly, to insert himself into roles he had no legal right to occupy. She stepped back. To the court, the case appeared neatly framed: fraud, impersonation, risk, liability. To the spectators, it sounded reasonable, sensible, necessary. Only a few noticed the tension that lingered in the silence that followed, not the tension of accusation, but of something unresolved. As if the charges, though well constructed, did not quite touch the stillness of the man they were meant to contain. And as Judge Crow prepared to respond, one truth hovered quietly in the room: the law had named its enemy, but it had not yet understood him. When it was finally his turn to speak, no one prompted him. There was no attorney leaning in with whispered advice, no objection rising to interrupt him. Gabriel Reyes simply lifted his eyes to the bench, as if acknowledging that the moment had arrived. The courtroom, so accustomed to rehearsed defenses and legal choreography, seemed to hold its breath. "Did you accept compensation for your services?" Judge Crow asked, his voice clip precise. Gabriel nodded once. People offered what they had. The prosecutor was already on her feet. "Your Honor, I never set a price." Gabriel continued calmly, his voice neither defensive nor apologetic. "I never demanded payment. Some gave food, some offered a place to sleep. One woman gave me a sweater because it was cold. I accepted with gratitude, not obligation." Judge Crow's eyes narrowed. "So you admit receiving value in exchange for services?" Gabriel did not argue the definition. He did not challenge the statute. Instead, he said something no one in the room had expected. "Words are bridges." The phrase landed oddly out of place among legal terms and evidentiary rules. A few spectators exchanged glances. The court reporter hesitated before typing. Bridges Crow repeated, unimpressed. "Yes," Gabriel said. "Between people, between fear and understanding, between a mother and a doctor, between a father and a judge, a bridge exists so that someone who cannot cross alone does not have to." The prosecutor scoffed quietly. "This is not a philosophy seminar." Gabriel turned slightly, not toward her, but toward the gallery. His gaze rested on a woman clutching immigration papers, her knuckles white. Then on a man in a hospital badge seated near the aisle. His voice did not rise, but it carried. "How do you put a price on a bridge?" he asked softly. "When someone is drowning on one side and help is standing on the other, do you stop to negotiate?" A murmur rippled through the room. The bailiff shifted. Even Judge Crow felt the pull of the words before he tightened his jaw. "This court requires facts, not metaphors," Crow said sharply. Gabriel nodded, accepting the rebuke without resistance. Then here is a fact. I never claimed authority over anyone. I never replaced a lawyer or a doctor. I listened. I spoke so they could be heard. The prosecutor stepped forward. You presented yourself as a professional interpreter. I presented myself as someone willing to help, Gabriel replied. The words came because they were needed. Crow leaned forward. You expect this court to believe language simply appeared when required? Gabriel met his gaze steadily. Language appears wherever suffering is willing to speak and someone is willing to listen. The courtroom had gone quiet again. Not the tense silence of conflict, but something heavier. Thoughtful, uncomfortable. From the jury box, empty but watching all the same, it felt as though the room itself was being addressed. The law spoke of credentials and boundaries. Gabriel spoke of need. Neither side yielded. Judge Crow inhaled slowly, measuring his next words. He had presided over countless self-represented defendants, many eloquent, some persuasive, all ultimately constrained by the same reality. Yet this defense unsettled him, not because it broke the rules, but because it refused to play the game entirely. Gabriel stood there unarmed by paperwork, unprotected by counsel offering no denial, only a question the courtroom was not designed to answer. If the law governs truth, who governs mercy? And in that pause before judgment could reclaim the floor, something shifted not in the record, but in the hearts of those who were listening. The judge's patience snapped not in anger, but in resolve. Judge Crow leaned back, fingers, steepled eyes fixed on the man before him. The metaphors, the quiet certainty, the way the room had begun to drift away from procedure, it had gone far enough. Mr. Reyes, he said evenly, this court does not rule on intentions. It rules on facts. He paused, then leaned forward again. You claim to speak 10 languages. Prove it. Now. The words landed like a gavel strike. A ripple of anticipation spread through courtroom 203. The prosecutor straightened confident. The court interpreter adjusted his headset, already preparing to expose memorized phrases and shallow tricks. In the gallery, heads lifted. Phones were lowered. Something irreversible had just been set in motion. Gabriel did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked around the room, not searching, not stalling, observing, as if he were taking attendance of souls rather than faces. To demonstrate a language, he said at last calmly, I need someone to speak it. A few quiet laughs escaped the back rows. Judge Crow raised an eyebrow. Convenient. It is necessary, Gabriel replied. Languages are not performances. They are relationships. The judge's mouth tightened. You are in no position to dictate terms. Before the tension could escalate, the court interpreter, a middle-aged man with a faint Egyptian accent, cleared his throat. Your Honor, he said cautiously, I speak Arabic. Gabriel turned toward him. When he spoke, the change was immediate. The Arabic that flowed from his lips was not formal textbook phrasing. It was rich, rhythmic, precise, threaded with regional nuance. The interpreter's posture shifted, then stiffened. His eyes widened. He forgot to translate. What did he say? The prosecutor demanded. The interpreter swallowed. He asked about my father, by name, and about the prayer he recites every dawn. A hush fell. Gabriel did not wait. He turned again, this time toward a clerk seated near the aisle. She froze as he spoke Mandarin, fluent, tonal, unmistakably native to a specific northern province. Her hand flew to her mouth. He's using my grandmother's dialect, she whispered. No one here speaks that. The courtroom was no longer breathing normally. French followed, elegant, precise. Then Russian, low, deliberate. Each language emerged without pause, without effort, without translation notes or searching glances. He did not recite phrases. He conversed, asked questions, answered reactions before they were spoken aloud. Judge Crow felt his certainty slipping not all at once, but grain by grain. Enough, the judge said sharply, though his voice lacked its earlier edge. You've memorized phrases. Gabriel turned to him, not confrontational, not triumphant. Patient. Then ask me anything, he said. In any language. Crow hesitated. That hesitation, barely a second, did not go unnoticed. The judge cleared his throat, choosing carefully. He spoke a language rarely heard in that room, one rooted, not in law or education, but in childhood. A dialect spoken only in private, only in memory. The moment Gabriel answered, Judge Crow's breath caught, not because the words were correct, but because they were familiar, painfully so. The courtroom stood frozen as the judge stared down from the bench, his knuckles whitening against the wood. Whatever he had expected to expose, whatever trap he had intended to set, had turned inward instead. And for the first time since the trial began, Judge Nathaniel Crow did not look like a man in control. He looked like a man who had just been heard completely for the first time in his life. Reason struck back swiftly. Judge Crow straightened, reclaiming the bench with visible effort. Whatever had flickered across his face moments earlier was sealed away behind discipline honed over decades. He exhaled once sharply as if clearing smoke from his mind. "Impressive," he said at last, "but not conclusive." The room stirred. The spell, if there had been one, wavered. Crow leaned forward, voice firm, almost relieved to hear it steady again. "Mimicry is not comprehension. Parrots can reproduce sound with astonishing accuracy. That does not make them linguists." A few spectators nodded. The prosecutor seized the opening like a lifeline. "Your Honor is correct," Assistant U.S. Attorney Park said quickly. "The demonstration proves nothing beyond phonetic imitation. There are documented cases of individuals with exceptional auditory memory, hyper-polyglot savants, who replicate language patterns without formal understanding." She gestured toward Gabriel, careful now measured. "What we witnessed could easily be rehearsed material, memorized responses tailored to emotional impact." Crow nodded, grateful for the reinforcement. This court will not be swayed by theatrics. The interpreter, who had spoken Arabic, shifted uneasily, but said nothing. The Mandarin-speaking clerk stared down at her desk, uncertain what to trust, her training or her instincts. Crow continued, the momentum returning. "If the defendant insists on presenting himself as an anomaly beyond explanation, then this court will treat the claim as such." He turned slightly toward the clerk. "Arrange for an independent, scientific evaluation." A murmur rose again, this time sharper, divided. A panel, Crow said, warming to the structure of it. Certified linguists, cognitive scientists, neurologists, experts who understand language not as metaphor, but as function. The prosecutor nodded vigorously. "We recommend a full assessment-controlled environment, randomized prompts, no audience." Crow's gaze returned to Gabriel. "If you possess genuine linguistic competence, it will withstand scrutiny. If not, this court will proceed on the charges of fraud and impersonation without further delay." The room settled into the familiar comfort of process. Panels, credentials, peer review. This was the terrain Reason knew how to defend. Gabriel listened without interruption. He did not protest, did not argue the terms. When the judge finished, he simply inclined his head. "Truth is not threatened by examination," he said quietly. Crow bristled. "This court is not in search of truth. It is in search of verifiable fact." Gabriel met his eyes. "Then you will find what you are prepared to see." The words lingered longer than they should have. For a moment, no one spoke. The prosecutor shuffled papers. The bailiff adjusted his stance. The courtroom, having been pulled to the edge of something unmeasurable, was being guided firmly back into the realm of charts, protocols, and safeguards. Crow struck the gavel lightly. "The defendant will be remanded pending evaluation." As the sound echoed, the judge felt a flicker of reassurance. Science would restore order. Experts would explain what emotion had clouded. Logic would prevail. And yet unspoken, unwanted a doubt pressed quietly beneath the surface. Because reason had countered faith before, but never against a man who did not resist it at all. Never against someone who seemed utterly unafraid of being examined. The Metropolitan Detention Center did not care who a man claimed to be. It rose along the East River like a slab of poured indifference, concrete stacked upon concrete windows, narrow and unforgiving. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed without pause, casting a pale glow that erased time and softened faces into shadows. Here, hope was not argued with. It was processed, logged, and often misplaced. Gabriel Reyes arrived without spectacle. No reporters followed. No crowd waited. Just the dull rhythm of intake procedures, fingerprints taken that matched no database, photographs that seemed oddly flat, as if the camera could not quite focus on him. An officer frowned at the screen, tapped it once, then moved on. The system had learned not to question silence, To the guards, he was another detainee awaiting evaluation. To the paperwork, a temporary number. To the building itself, just another presence absorbed into its corridors. The cell block smelled of disinfectant and fatigue. Doors slammed shut with mechanical finality. Voices echoed, some angry, some broken, most resigned. Men from different nations occupied the same narrow spaces, divided by language, memory, and fear. Gabriel was led down a corridor where hope thinned with each step. A Dominican guard glanced at the file in his hand, then at Gabriel. "You don't look like the others," he muttered, not unkindly. Gabriel smiled faintly. "They don't look like themselves in here either." The guard said nothing more. Inside the holding unit, the lights never dimmed. Sleep came in fragments. Conversations dissolved into misunderstanding. Men shouted past one another, trapped not just by bars, but by the inability to be heard. It was here where language usually failed that something began to change. In the corner of a common cell, a Middle Eastern man sat apart, gripping a worn photograph, lips moving in silent grief. Nearby, a young Asian detainee stared at the floor, sketching the same shape again and again with a finger. A large man with prison tattoos paced restless, haunted by something unnamed. They noticed Gabriel not because he spoke, but because he listened. When the Syrian man finally broke his voice, cracking in words no one around him understood, Gabriel answered softly. The man froze. The language was his, not formal, not learned, his childhood tongue. Tears came fast, uncontrollable. Others looked up. A second voice followed, then a third. The darkness of the detention center did not lift, but it shifted. Something unseen moved between bunks and concrete walls. Men who had not spoken in days leaned forward. Men hardened by years of silence found themselves answering questions they had never dared to ask aloud. No sermons were given, no miracles announced, only understanding. From the corridor, a corrections officer paused, listening. He could not make out the words, but he heard the change in tone. Voices steadying breath, slowing anger, loosening its grip. In a place designed to strip men of identity, something impossible was happening. They were being seen. And in the deepest shadow of the system, where reason had sent Gabriel to be measured, contained, explained the ground, quietly prepared itself for something reason had never learned how to control. Because light does not announce itself in darkness. It simply begins to work. Night settled heavily over the Metropolitan Detention Center, pressing against concrete walls that had learned to absorb despair without reaction. Inside the shared cell, 6 men lay awake, not because of noise or fear, but because something had shifted that could not be named. It began without ceremony. The Syrian man, eyes red from weeping, whispered a question into the dark, not to anyone in particular. It was the kind of question asked only when hope is already exhausted. The words came out in a dialect spoken only in his village, a dialect shaped by lost prayer and childhood lullabies his mother used to sing before the war erased everything familiar. Jesus Christ answered him, not in formal Arabic, not in language learned from books, but in the exact cadence of home, the softened consonants, the pauses where grief lived, the phrases used only when speaking to family. The man sat up abruptly, breath caught in his throat. "How do you know that way of speaking?" he whispered. Jesus did not explain. He spoke again gently, and the words landed not on the ears but somewhere deeper. The man's shoulders shook as years of restrained sorrow finally found a place to rest. The others watched unsure until the next voice rose. A young man from China spoke next, hesitant, ashamed. His Mandarin was fractured by fear, but beneath it lay a regional dialect from a mountain province, one he had not spoken since childhood. Jesus turned to him and answered not only in his dialect, but with the rhythm his grandmother used when correcting him as a boy. The young man broke down instantly. Then another. A former soldier from Eastern Europe stared at the wall, jaw clenched, carrying memories he believed unforgivable. When Jesus spoke to him, it was not in standard Russian, but in the rough dialect of his childhood, mixed with words spoken only by those who had known war too closely. The man's hands began to tremble. "I have done things God cannot forgive," he said. Jesus looked at him steadily. "There is no language of sin that mercy does not understand." One by one, the barriers collapsed, not of steel or concrete, but of isolation. Each man heard something different, yet each understood completely. Jesus did not speak 10 languages, he spoke one. The dialect of the soul. It was the language beneath words, the tone that carries truth, the silence that knows when to pause, the compassion that does not require credentials. In that cell, justice was not argued. Theology was not debated. Science was not challenged. Men were simply known. From the corridor, a guard stopped again, drawn by the sound, or rather by the absence of the usual sounds. No shouting, no pacing, just quiet voices, steady breathing, occasional sobs that sounded more like relief than despair. Inside the cell, something holy unfolded without spectacle. No light burst from the ceiling, no chains fell from wrists. Yet men who had entered the night bound by guilt, grief, and fear found themselves resting, if only briefly, in peace. Jesus Christ sat among them as one of them. No authority claimed, no identity revealed. And yet every heart in that room understood something instinctively. They were not alone. And for the first time since the system had named them numbers instead of names, they felt heard in the only language that truly mattered, the one spoken, not by the tongue, but by the truth that reaches where words can never go. The evaluation room at the Metropolitan Detention Center was designed for control, not wonder. Concrete walls, a metal table bolted to the floor, 2 cameras mounted high in opposite corners. 5 experts sat in a neat line, credentials, impeccable reputations, untouchable. Linguistics, neurology, cognitive science. A Vatican-trained polyglot invited as an observer, not a believer. This panel existed to explain anomalies, not surrender to them. Jesus Christ was brought in quietly. No restraints, no visible anxiety. He greeted them politely and took the offered chair, hands, folded eyes attentive. To the panel, he looked ordinary. Too ordinary for the stories already circulating through the building. They began clinically. Standardized prompts, randomized language switching, increasing difficulty, controlled variables. The first exchanges produced nods, acknowledgement of fluency, impressive, but not unprecedented. The neurologist noted reaction times. The linguist marked pronunciation accuracy. The skeptic relaxed. Then the questions changed. One expert switched to an archaic form of Hebrew, used only in ancient liturgical texts. Jesus responded effortlessly, then corrected a subtle semantic error in the question itself. The room shifted. Another expert tried a regional Japanese dialect spoken almost exclusively by elderly residents of a single prefecture. Jesus answered not just correctly, but personally, using expressions tied to post-war scarcity and familial honor. The expert froze, pen hovering midair. The neurologist leaned forward. This level of contextual integration requires decades of cultural immersion. Jesus met her gaze. Or one moment of love where words mattered more than survival. They pressed harder. Dead languages, hybrid dialects, phrases intentionally malformed to provoke error. Each attempt did not expose a limit, it revealed depth. Jesus did not translate mechanically. He understood why words existed, where they came from, what pain or hope had shaped them. Then the Vatican observer stood. Protocol did not permit what he was about to do. He knew that. But something in the room demanded honesty and more than order. He spoke a dialect no living community officially used anymore, an Aramaic variant once preserved by a small monastic order, destroyed in war. No recordings, no modern instruction. He asked a single question. "Who are you?" Jesus closed his eyes. When he answered, the language was perfect, but it was the voice that broke the room. It carried age and intimacy, sorrow and authority, as if centuries of prayer had found breath again. The observer collapsed into his chair, hands shaking, tears spilling freely. He answered, the man whispered. He answered as if the language had been waiting for him. Silence consumed the room. The skeptic tried to speak about memory pattern, recognition, theoretical anomalies, but the words would not assemble. The neurologist stared at her own notes as if they belonged to someone else. The linguist slowly closed his folder. At last the panel chair spoke, voice hollow. "This cannot be learned." No one argued. Because what had undone them was not vocabulary or syntax. It was recognition. Each expert had felt it, the unsettling sense of being addressed, not examined. Known, not tested. Their science could measure language acquisition. It could map neural pathways. It could explain imitation. But it had no instruments for the language that had just spoken to them, the one that named grief without probing truth, without coercion, and identity without introduction. When the session ended, no conclusion was recorded. Only one line appeared in the preliminary report, typed and deleted, then typed again. Observed phenomenon exceeds current explanatory frameworks. And for the first time in their careers, the experts left a room not with answers, but with something far more dangerous to certainty. A truth they could not unhear. The courtroom was fuller than before. Word had spread quietly through clerks, through guards, through experts who spoke carefully, but never denied what they had seen. Courtroom 203 felt different that morning, as if the walls themselves remembered the last silence too well to return to routine. Jesus Christ stood again at the defendant's table. No chains, no lawyer. The same calm. Judge Nathaniel Crowe entered precisely on time, but those who knew him sensed the change immediately. His posture remained upright, his robe immaculate, but something in his eyes had shifted. The certainty that once hardened his gaze had thinned, replaced by a vigilance that bordered on fear. The reports lay open before him, inconclusive, unexplainable, exceeds scientific frameworks. Crowe read them once more slowly, as if hoping the words might rearrange themselves into something manageable. They did not. This court has reviewed the findings, he said at last, voice controlled. They establish extraordinary ability, but ability alone does not resolve the matter of fraud. The prosecutor stood ready, but Crowe raised a hand. He was not finished. He looked directly at Jesus. You speak of bridges, the judge said, of understanding, of compassion. His voice tightened almost imperceptibly. But language, as far as this court is concerned, is still a tool, and tools can deceive. Jesus did not interrupt. Crowe swallowed, then spoke again, slowly, deliberately. There is one final test. A murmur rippled through the room. There is a dialect, Crowe continued, spoken by fewer than 200 people in the mountains of the Caucasus. My mother spoke it. She never taught it publicly, never recorded it. It exists nowhere in official archives. His hands rested flat on the bench now. If you truly speak as you claim, speak to me in the language of my mother. Silence fell. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Jesus closed his eyes. When he spoke, the sound was unlike anything heard before, not loud, not dramatic. The dialect flowed softly, shaped by memory rather than grammar. It carried lullabies whispered at night, prayers murmured in kitchens, grief spoken only in private. Judge Crowe froze. The color drained from his face. His fingers tightened against the wood, as if the bench were the only thing holding him upright. Because Jesus was not merely speaking the dialect, he was using the exact turns of phrase Crowe's mother had used, the ones she spoke only when afraid, only when praying. Crowe's breath broke. Jesus shifted gently into English. She forgave you long ago, he said quietly. She understood your anger. She knew why you stopped believing, and she never stopped praying that one day you would find peace. The courtroom did not move. Crowe's knees buckled. He dropped to the floor behind the bench, sobbing openly, years of pride, grief, and unanswered questions collapsing at once. No one tried to stop it. At last he rose, changed. The charges against this man are dismissed, Crowe said hoarsely. Immediately. The prosecutor started to object, then stopped. Crowe removed his robe slowly and placed it on the bench. I am no longer fit to judge what I do not understand. Jesus nodded once. When the court adjourned, he was gone. No escort, no release paperwork. One moment standing at the table, then absent, as if he had never needed permission to leave. In the weeks that followed, the case became a footnote. The judge resigned. The experts rewrote their fields. The men from the detention center rebuilt their lives, carrying forward what they had been given. And sometimes, quietly, unexpectedly, people across the city spoke of encounters. A stranger who listened, who spoke in the language of their pain, who vanished once hope returned. Because the legacy of that day was not 10 languages spoken, it was one truth revealed, that beyond law and logic, beyond science and pride, there is a language older than words, the language of love. This story leaves a lesson that reaches far beyond the courtroom. In a world that rewards credentials, logic, and proof, it reminds us that some truths cannot be measured, only recognized. Jesus Christ did not defeat arrogance with argument, nor skepticism with force. He listened. He spoke to people in the language their hearts understood: pain, memory, love, forgiveness. And that changed everything. In daily life, we often rush to judge, label, and dismiss what we cannot explain. We value being right more than being compassionate. Yet healing rarely begins with answers. It begins when someone feels truly heard. When we choose humility over pride, listening over debating, mercy over certainty, we become bridges rather than walls. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to our channel, leave a comment sharing what it awakened in you, and share this video with someone who may need hope today. Stay with us to discover more powerful stories on Stories of Grace.